right, I'm back. Been a while. Um, I don't know if that bothers you or if you were delighted not to see me, but I've been busy doing a lot. I'm trying to get to all the student comments on the Canvas discussions for all three of my classes. I've got two sections of 2810 and your section of 2108. So it's a lot of work, and if you don't believe me, check out some of the articles online right now about the difficulties of trying to do a synchronous remote instruction. It's a lot of work. So hopefully it's not to no avail. I'm gonna try to keep doing the best I can in terms of keeping in touch with you guys through a variety of means, and I'm going to try to keep providing new readings along with my explanations of them at a regular pace. It's going to be kind of up to you to keep pace with the rest of us. Some people are getting to new readings almost as soon as I post them, and other people seem to be lagging 2 weeks behind everybody else. As I don't meet with you in person, it's awful hard for me to be the kind of leader or cheerleader that you need to motivate you. So I'll do the best I can. And if you're not feeling confident about your performance, or if you're unsure about something or other, you know how to find me. Questions about the contents of reading, as always, use the Canvas discussion board for that. And if you have questions about where to find something, how you're doing, any practical matters like that, that's when you can use email. I'll respond to email best just because that's what I turn to most habitually. Canvas, I'm getting the hang of it, but I'll check my email religiously, whereas the inbox on Canvas, not so much. So I apologize if I've overlooked anybody. I'm trying to get to all of you, but this is a brutal semester. All right, I'm going to stop moaning about my fate. I hope you guys are faring a little better than I am. And now I'm going to try to get into Clement Greenberg. These were a lot of readings, and I'm surprised some of you did so well with them. Others were banging your head against the desktop again. I certainly understand that. These aren't easy, and I remember the first time I read through them, and I was aghast at what I saw and how little of it I understood. But whether you agree with these or not, they do make sense. And that's all you have to do, is try to read these as if you were learning a foreign language, or as if you were cracking a code, or just trying to get some insight into major statements made in the 20th century. So you don't have to agree, though it's always nice if you do agree. And I don't think I've ever read anything in my entire life where I didn't find one valuable thing to take away from it. So that's your goal, to try to take away one valuable thing from each reading. If what you take away is only a question, fine. Then pose it to me and I'll answer it, and that just gives me one more thing on which to base my lecture. It makes my life easier, not harder, and it helps me provide materials you're actually interested in. So I'll leave it at that. I could keep warming up like this, but I just want to get into the Greenberg in the interest of keeping this video short, so I can go on to make one for my other courses and then get back to you guys about a reading that I'll probably post later today, just as soon as this video's done, though that's going to take hours and hours and hours, so bear with me. All right, so Greenberg, as I might have mentioned to you, it's hard to remember anymore. Greenberg is a pivotal figure for a number of reasons. There's famous paintings of him, or at least one famous painting of him by a guy named Mark Tansey. You can go see it like I did at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York City, now that the museums there are starting to open again. Anyhow, Mark Tansey, sometime I believe in the 1980s, makes a famous painting of Clement Greenberg. Not him exclusively. It's a historical-looking painting with all kinds of figures from the world of art represented in it. But at the very center of this painting is going to be the figure of Clement Greenberg, who is cast in the role of the American general at the end of the Second World War. Would have been MacArthur, if I'm not mistaken. And he's at the table with the documents stating the terms of surrender, but rather than seeing another general from World War II standing across from Greenberg, we instead see the enemy forces represented by Pablo Picasso, who is going to approach the table and indeed sign the terms of surrender. So what we see happening in this painting, it's just one person's view of things, though certainly he's a smart person, who's gotten a lot of attention. And last time I went to LA to go to museums, there was his work all over the place. But what he's suggesting is that starting sometime around around the Second World War, and soon thereafter, the center of gravity of the art world begins to shift to America. Where was the center of the art world prior to this? For the most part, Paris, and that had been the case since the 19th century. People from England, people from Germany, people from Russia are going to head over to Paris to be at the center of all of this cultural foment and creative activity. But with the rise of the Second World War, all kinds of people need to get out of Europe for all kinds of famous reasons. And as a consequence of that, the art world does indeed shift to the new world from the old, and it's going to be based not in Paris but in New York City, around a group of painters who will eventually become known as the New York School, and I'll give you examples of that to take a look at. So we're seeing this geographical shift. We're seeing a chronological shift, as Greenberg is more of a World War II era figure, at least as he's represented in this painting by Mark Tansey, called The Triumph of the New York School. But we're also seeing a shift in roles. So prior to this, the people who would have been seen the most important members of that creative set we call the art world would have been the artists themselves, and nobody embodies that more, at least for the first half of the 20th century, than Pablo Picasso. His name is essentially synonymous with modern art in the same way that Einstein's name is synonymous with modern physics. And yet we see Picasso here, the artist, now surrendering to Greenberg, the critic. The critics now are beginning to take a role as important, if not more important, in determining not only what art is good, but because the critics, especially Greenberg, now begin to coach or mentor painters with respect to their craft. We see this tripartite shift, again, geographical, chronological, and then the shift in terms of role. So Greenberg's at the center of this painting. Now, whether he'd actually like the painting and the role in which he's cast, that's another matter, and I'll maybe get to that a little bit later if I can remember to do that. But what I want you to see is what a pivotal figure Greenberg is for creating a sense of taste and a sense of what our general project is as moderns in the 20th century. His influence is not to be underestimated. He's not the only person who's a high roller and a shaker and a mover. Another person who I could lecture on, but not as extensively as Greenberg, would be Alfred Barr. He's going to be the curator who takes over the Museum of Modern Art in the early 20th century, and he begins to try to map out all the new styles which are emerging, and it's very, very hard to discount his influence as well, though we're going to work with Greenberg. So let me dive right into the first article, Avant-Garde and Kitsch, written in 1939. So if you want to think about what's happening in America and Europe in 1939, don't believe America's yet entered the war, but there's certainly lots of commotion in Europe at the time, and you probably want to locate this, at least chronologically, in that background. The title is going to point out two phenomena which Greenberg sees as emerging simultaneously to one another. But what they tend to show, and this is going to be something that social critique of the sort Greenberg does, is point out major contradictions in any social construction. Now, the word, which will get used in many ways, for the attempt to resolve, usually in an imaginary fashion, these divisions, inconsistencies on which society is founded, that word's ideology. He won't use it, at least not at the beginning of this essay, but he nevertheless is going to acknowledge the fact that we as Americans believe that e pluribus unum, united we stand. We have an American identity. We have a common cultural heritage. Not that that's even the case, but he's assuming that that's what other people assume. And yet when we look at the supposed unity of America, what we find is a shocking inconsistency in the quality of art that the culture is able to produce. So he'll talk about a T.S. Eliot poem. We know who T.S. Eliot is by now, for better or worse. But Tin Pan Alley, what's that going to be? It's going to be cheap musical theater songs, actually created in London, where T.S. Eliot is living. But it's the type of, be the musical equivalent of cheap paperback novels, romance novels or real crime novels or something like that. So one is going to be very consciously striving to achieve something uniquely modern and challenging, while the other is meant for immediate, thoughtless consumption. And what Greenberg wants to ask, how is it possible that the same culture which produces one produces the other? It seems that this rift requires some type of explanation, and that's exactly what he's going to do. His thought, though, is that if we're going to explain this rift between the high and the low, the quality and in the inferior, we're going to have to do it in social and historical terms. So if you think back to Eliot, history was not of great interest to him. The historical sense that he talked about was just getting a general feel for what it might have been like to be an Elizabethan, getting a general feel for what it might have been like to live in the Baroque era. getting a feel for what it generally might have felt like to live in the age of Johnson. That's the historical sense he's talking about. And yeah, that's important, but ultimately the dates and the names and the details of history, that simply doesn't interest him. What he's interested in is not the biography or the personality of the author. He's interested in the creative act that goes into the production of a text, a poem, a painting, a piece of music, and our ability to understand that thing divorced from history. We try to understand it as best we can in isolation, but if we do, and we will inevitably end up comparing it to other standards of measure, and that's what we call the canon, we're not looking at those in historical terms either. It's just seeing this big conversation or this big constellation that's composed of the relationship between text and text, no matter who wrote it, no matter when they wrote it. It's this timeless world of ideas that Eliot is most interested in, and Greenberg's just not going to buy into that at all. We have to look for the very specific historical, which is to say material and economic conditions which allow certain forms of art to appear. Without the proper preconditions being put in place, one couldn't even dream up a new form of art, much less execute it. So he's working not from the mind down to the physical world, but he's working from the physical world up to the realm of the mind. So leaping into this first section, he's going to say at a certain point in a culture's history, it starts to lose a sense of self-confidence, and it becomes stuck. This might not make sense at first. He's saying all traditional values get called into question. Nothing seems like what it was. And you'd think this liberation from the past would free people up to do anything that they care to in the most capricious and arbitrary manner, but that's actually not what he thinks. It's this heightened self-awareness, heightened self-consciousness, which actually freezes people up. They become afraid to do anything that isn't familiar, isn't acceptable, isn't immediately recognized, and we end up in a state that he calls motionless Alexandrianism. It simply refers to that city. It would have been a Greek satellite conquest of Alexander the Great, in, say, around, what would it be, like 350 before the Common Era. He ends up in northern Egypt on the shore of the Mediterranean. He builds a new city, names it after himself, called Alexandria. That's where the famous library was. But what Greenberg is interested in here is this notion that Alexandrian culture is a culture of scribes, a culture of grammarians, a culture of people who don't really do anything to move beyond previous forms of art which were created in Athens hundreds of years prior to this. All they can do is quibble and correct and polish pre-existing forms, so things become smoother, more refined, more exquisite in their delicacy, but it's just polishing and sanding and smoothing and waxing and buffing out. There's no courageous steps forward into the new. Virtuosity in small details, he says, is what becomes the order of the day. So we can always paint shadows or highlights just a little bit better, but our fundamental understanding of what the human anatomy is and how it might be represented, all that's getting lost in the pursuit of impeccability or perfectionism. And for Greenberg, this is a total dead end. He'll talk then, and this is quite a leap from ancient Alexandria, though what he has in mind, although he calls it Alexandrianism, is what is beginning to take place in post-revolutionary times. If you think of the French Revolution, well, so we can behead kings, we can overthrow an entire class of people, we can change the calendar back to year zero. Anything that anybody imagined to be simply the case, all of that's being brought into question. So this is really in post-revolutionary times. French Revolution would have been 1789. And soon after, new forms of government appear, and if people aren't being sent to the guillotine, then works of art are being destroyed. But at the same time, museums are being set up. Everything's up for grabs, and it's against this background that Greenberg is saying the avant-garde and kitsch are going to arise. So the point of the avant-garde for him is not even to produce something which is perfect, because to declare it to be perfect would require that we have a set of criteria where we can judge objectively that the thing is perfect. But if you're making something truly new, there aren't criteria available for you to be able to judge this thing. So the avant-garde is going to begin as part of this revolutionary cause, but soon enough, these people who he calls bohemians, they get either disillusioned or bored with politics. All they really want to do is make new art, and so they withdraw into their own little world and try to live entirely on their own terms. This generally leads to them leading very impoverished lives, and the whole stereotype of the starving artist is going to arise from around this time. So, these guys could starve, but they had to eat something, and those who had any success at all were going to owe it to a patron. And so the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, the factory owners, the people who own capital, are going to have some vested interest in acquiring luxury goods so that they can announce to themselves and everybody else that they're all that. And the bohemians, or the artistic class, those people are going to be furnishing these goods. They're tied to the ruling class, whether they want to be or not, for the sheer sake of survival. But the ultimate goal of the avant-garde is it's again not to produce perfection. It's just to keep the conversation going, just to get us always moving in one direction or another, and not getting caught up in this Alexandrianism. To put it in more economic terms, which is what Greenberg's asking us to do anyway, with the rise of modern factories and all of that, what we get as a society very good at doing is not producing anything new. What we get good at doing is reproducing the same old thing again and again and again. This is what factories do. Every car that comes out of the plant off this particular assembly line is going to look exactly like any other. Oh, this one's blue, that one's red. Yeah, these keep you addicted to this notion that you need to be with the times, keeping up with the neighbors, amazing your friends with all of your new gadgets. We're going to deliberately render these devices, these commodities, which we feel are so absolutely necessary for survival, though they most likely are not. These things are always being made obsolete. Some new updated version comes out in order to render the old version obsolete, even though it worked perfectly well. And all right, you can say this is innovation, but it's, version 2.0 isn't going to be appreciably different from 1.0, and 3.0 is not going to be appreciably different from 2.0. They're just incidental variations which are designed to make us feel that we're falling behind the times and that we need to keep up with everybody else. But this is not innovation. This is not production. It's reproduction. And what the avant-garde is trying to do, here, if you haven't seen me write it on the blog already, I'll say it right now. Greenberg is a Marxist, and so as a Marxist, he's going to be interested in material and historical explanations, infrastructural explanations for cultural phenomena that we see as superstructure. So the apex, if you will, of the pyramid is going to be a reflection of the base. And as a Marxist, he's going to believe that thing which defines us as human beings is got to be material. That's going to be our labor. It's going to be our productivity. But we live in a society which is, for the most part, addicted to reproduction, not production. Yet the avant-garde is going to try to produce something new. It may not be something of utilitarian value. It's going to be something, we might say, of absolute value. So turning the page, Greenberg is going to talk about the avant-garde poet or artist trying to imitate God, to create something that is valid solely on its own terms, in the way nature itself is valid, in the way a landscape, not its picture, is aesthetically valid, something given, increate, independent of meanings, similars, or originals. Content is to be dissolved so completely into the form that the work of art or literature cannot be reduced in whole or in part to anything not itself. So the same way that if you believe in a God, there was nothing and then something as valid as reality itself or the earth itself is called into being. This is what the artists want to do, emancipating yourself as much as you possibly can from any external influences. You want to be free. And the place that you can be most free, as far as they're concerned, is creating art, because art, understood as art and not as a tool for either physical labor or for moral instruction, now it exists on its own term. It has what we call dignity. It's autonomous. And this is exactly what artists want to do. In the same way that God can do anything he wants to as the absolute authority of the universe, the artist wants to be that in charge of his or her own production. The thing is, being human, we're not God, and so we're going to have to do that on a restricted, not an absolute level. And so each artist is going to have to pick a medium in which they can work. What do I mean by medium? A medium is either painting or sculpting or playing music, writing poetry, writing fiction, dance. All of these are different artistic mediums, but each artistic medium has its own material of which it's made. You don't paint with marble, and you don't sculpt with canvas, nor do you literature with pigment or with marble. So each medium is specific, and what the artist ends up doing in order to gain as much autonomy as possible in the production of their artworks is they hunker down into their medium, and rather than trying to represent the external world, what they're really focusing on is the medium itself. Rather than trying to imitate the external world, Greenberg says that they imitate the imitation, or they imitate their own natures. And in the process of doing this, painting is going to get more painterly. Literature is going to get more literary. sculpture is going to become more sculptorly. Now, it sounds like I'm just speaking in tautologies, but what it means is now we've got painters whose brushstrokes are not concealed. If you conceal the brushstroke so that it looks like you're staring through a window, you're denying the fact that you're a painter. But if you allow your brushstrokes to be seen, if you leave traces of the actual creative process whereby you are painting, the painting becomes not a transparent window through which we can look, but it becomes an opaque object in the concrete world, and we focus on the painting as a painting and not as a painting of something other than itself. So this is sort of the origins of the avant-garde. It's this attempt to anchor ourselves as securely in our specific medium, and in this process gaining autonomy, or you could use the word freedom. But the point is this: freedom is not the ability or the permission to go off and do any random thing that you want to. Freedom is the ability to recognize what materials you are working with and to use them in the most conscious, deliberate, and specific manner possible. So freedom, again, is not freedom to do anything that you want to, but it's freedom from external influences which compromise the integrity of our work. And with that in mind, you can start to see why modern art looks the way that it does. We want the painting to look like a painting made out of pigment on a two-dimensional surface. All the brush strokes become much thicker and goopier, and eventually you can't necessarily even tell what the painting is of, but not having to worry about the content is what gives you the opportunity to focus on how paint is being used as a plastic means of investigating the physical characteristics of the material world in the form of the specific medium or tools that you're using. One of the things that Greenberg will talk about really quickly is something that could seem like a contradiction in him, and I wouldn't say that it isn't a contradiction in him, though I don't know that it's unwitting. He just realizes he's arguing an unusual position. If he is the Marxist that he claims to be, then you would expect that he would be the champion of the proletariat, the working classes, and be the enemy of the upper classes, the ruling classes. However, it seems that he still has some type of odd sympathy for the ruling class. As a matter of fact, I don't think it's so much sympathy for the ruling class. It's the fact that with the rise of mass production, with the rise of mass consumption, and with the rise of mass obsolescence and everything entailed with all of that, on a massive scale, this is something that I've talked about tangentially in some of my blog posts on extinction. What Greenberg is looking at is the potential extinction of high art. And to be able to fund and to appreciate fine art, it does take a fair amount of education, careful cultivation of one's sensibilities, and the free time to immerse yourself in a world of artistic creations which are genuinely fine and examples of human ingenuity in its purest form, creating something which is a genuinely new statement, if you will, though it exists for no apparent commercial reasons. But with the economy and the political system in the 19th century and into the 20th century becoming more and more catered to the masses, there are fewer and fewer people who are actually able to distinguish something, as he says, increate and valid on its own terms. And Greenberg's worried that we're going to lose art altogether, that like the 50% of the species that David Attenborough talks about, or like the 40% of plant life across the planet that the Guardian article talks about, as those appear poised to vanish forever, Greenberg thinks that culture, which is more interesting to him for whatever reason, that stands endangered in the same way that natural species are, and he wants to defend it, protect it, in the same way that other people want to protect the environment. So it's this produce a genuine, durable culture. But what gets in the way of it is going to be this thing that he calls Alexandrianism and academism. Most of you hear the word academic and you'll think of it as a compliment, but as a matter of fact, it's not. The way the term academic is used in Greenberg refers to people who, rather than going out on their own and courageously creating something genuinely new, they go off to some conservatory where they can learn to paint in an Alexandrian fashion. They're going to use all of the techniques that were developed in the Renaissance, but they're going to now begin to achieve those types of effects that we first developed in Renaissance painting with more readily available, easier to use materials, and they're going to learn how to paint in schools according to a set of rules governing both content and the way that content is represented through the craft techniques that they're using, and they'll produce a kind of painting which is readily recognizable. It's going to be stories from classical antiquity or from the Bible. It's going to be painted on large canvases with all kinds of sumptuous colors and dramatic scenes being depicted, and it's going to be done with a touch such that you can't even tell it's a painting. Again, you feel like you're looking through a window onto the past. The painting itself has become completely transparent, and this is what we call academism, and it's a term of abuse. It's a term of disparagement. It's the word for people who, yes, achieve a certain kind of perfection of result, but they do so in a way which is entirely schooled, entirely predictable, and made for the consumption of wealthy and individual patrons. So anyway, this is what's going on with the leisure class and the rise of the avant-garde in the early 19th century. But he says wherever there's an avant-garde, there's going to be a rear guard, and that's what we call kitsch. So kitsch is going to be popular commercial art designed to be easily understood, easily purchased, easily consumed, and easily discarded so that we can move on to the next. So he'll mention again Tin Pan Alley music, Hollywood movies. It's meant merely as entertainment to be consumed and then to be forgotten. Now, the reason that this kind of art needs to appear is not only because we can make it, but one of the things that's been produced by the Industrial Revolution is not just cheaper furniture or more expensive kitchenware, but another thing that's been produced by the Industrial Revolution is an entire class of people known as the proletariat. This is the working class. These are those people who have. It's not like they can, it's not like they want to, but they must move to the cities to fill the factories. And the reason for this is because the land has been enclosed. They used to be able to live out in the woods or the pasture, live in the country, and farm subsistence manner to take care of their own needs, maybe sell a little bit of surplus so that, or maybe store away for a lean year, but they could live off the land. Once we built these factories, we needed people who would man them, and the way to get these people to work horrible jobs under deplorable circumstances for a wage that was just barely enough on which to survive, 7-day weeks, 16-hour days, working under hot, dangerous, miserable conditions, men, women, and children packed into small little spaces. The reason people were willing to take those jobs is because they couldn't live off the land anymore. And they couldn't live off the land because of the enclosure. In Great Britain, which was the, cradle of the Industrial Revolution, they privatized and enclosed, or the government occupied, all of the common grounds, all of the free land, which was considered simply God's country, and off which people could live. And now, rather than starve, there was only one recourse for them. That was to move to the city, live in a tenement, and spend your entire life slaving away to make somebody else 1,000 times wealthier than you, if not more so. We still live in that world today. And being worked to the bone, not having any substantial kind of leisure, not having the proper training or cultural and material resources to be able to appreciate the plastic qualities of genuine art, in the few spare moments that they have, these people are going to try to lose themselves, kill time until it's the hour to go back to work. And so one of the ways that they can kill time, and the famous phrase for this from Karl Marx, is the opiate of the masses, which is religion. So there's going to be lots of revival movements and things like that going on at this time. It's at this moment in history where all of the popular hymns that sound set to folk tunes, first emerge, because these are being produced for people who are coming out of the factories. They're completely anesthetized from the monotony and the brutality of the work, and now they want to turn to something for another form of excitement. And so popular religion's going to become one of those things. Greenberg will refer to it as the opium of the masses. Of course, the masses could always turn directly to opium, or if not opium, they could turn to alcohol or other things. And what Greenberg is suggesting is that this new kind of mass-produced, easily consumed and easily forgotten, insubstantial art that is readily available and cheap for factory workers or any other lowly person like that, that's kitsch. Kitsch is a German term, quite literally translated into English, it means shit. And this kitsch is being generated for these people so that they've got something to do. Kitsch is going to be another form of opium for the masses. It keeps people inebriated, it keeps them besotted, and therefore uncomfortable enough that they don't feel like taking up arms, and inebriated enough that they're not able to take up arms even if they wanted to. Why don't these people from the country just stick to folk culture? Because folk culture can only exist under certain conditions too. People didn't come up with artisanal blankets or artisanal embroidery or artisanal wood carving or styles of architecture just out of nowhere, just because they felt like doing it this way and not another. But the folk culture, including folk songs and folk dances and all of that, it only really makes sense. It can only be produced under certain conditions which do not exist in tenements in Liverpool and Birmingham and other filthy, crowded, polluted, and oppressive cities like that. It makes no sense. It wouldn't even be possible to create and to enjoy folk culture. These people have become sufficiently deracinated, sufficiently de-skilled, because that's what factory work is all about. You just do one simple task again and again for 16 hours. Anybody could do it. And when you drop dead on the job, anybody can take your place. Not everybody can do artisanal work of the sort that you would see in the traditional countryside, but these people are now cut off from that in every imaginable way, and yet there are a few hours in the day where they've got nothing to do, and so this new capacity for boredom arises. This is exactly what kitsch is going to address, and that kitsch and avant-garde are extremely different. Greenberg does not debate, but it seems to him that a kitsch culture cannot exist without some host on which it can draw parasitically. So avant-garde comes up with something new, and immediately kitsch has come up with a dumbed-down version that everybody can relate to, and it's constantly feeding off the innovations of the avant-garde, and for this reason the avant-garde is driven to keep moving forward so that it doesn't become banal, redundant, and devoid of the autonomy which it had tried to earn for itself in the first place. He'll say that kitsch and the academic are not exactly the same thing, but he will say that the academic is one form of kitsch, because comic books and blockbuster movies, TV series, all of that, that's one form of kitsch. Academic painting, where we produce art for luxury art for a wealthy and leisured clientele, that's perhaps a little bit more deluxe than cheap stuff that you can get at the dollar store. Nevertheless, it's made in a completely predictable fashion. It's valued commercially in a completely predictable fashion. People are beginning now to make careers off of art. This is what the Academy is all about. Once upon in the Renaissance, you would never go to the community college or to the U of U to major in painting or sculpture or theater. You learned it in a trade guild, but now people are deciding that being an artist is perhaps a wise career move. Perhaps there's money to be made, but you're going to have to paint in a way that makes sense to a consumer and a clientele or a patron. Consequently, you've lost your autonomy. You've made yourself the subsidiary or the servant to that master who's got the money that you're interested in. Kitsch, he says, is not just easy, but it's virulent, and it tends to spread. So that now, if you actually do go out into the country, kitsch has found its way into most remote areas. It's actively and aggressively replacing traditional culture wherever it can. He says wiping out folk culture. It's the closest thing that we've ever come to a one world universal culture. So the dream of the Enlightenment, which was that everybody could read, everybody would have access to literature, and we would live in a one world culture of reason where there wouldn't have to be disputes and wars. It's actually turned into a nightmare. It's become a global culture of garbage.